Before repairing or operating the engine, please abide by the following recommended practices. Always wear goggles and safety shoes. Remove earrings, watch, long jewelry or metal objects. Be sure to use the intact tools. Be careful to work on electrical components because high voltage will cause the personal casualty. Before removing or disconnecting pipe fittings or related items, release the system pressure as required. Always abide by the instructions to perform the pressure leak test. Always observe the technical specifications. Tighten the pipe fittings and connectors, as over-tightening or under-tightening may result in the thread damage and leakage. Fasteners should be replaced with the ones with the same part number or equivalent. The video is recorded according to Foton Cummins ISG Engine Maintenance Manual. All the data and technical specification listed in this course should be used for training only. Look up the service manual on QuickServe online for the latest information. This video teaching material on ISG engine overhaul is mainly used for the training of ISG engine servicemen. With this video, you will quickly and accurately get familiar with Foton Cummins ISG engines in terms of repair and assembly processes and technical requirements, so as to bring your repairing capacity to a new high. This course is suitable for those mechanical servicemen of engine who has 3 years of repair experience or longer. Apprentices need to be guided by experienced technicians to watch and learn the video. In the actual repair practice, please refer to technical specifications and standards and use the required tools so as to provide customers with and standard repair services. Tools used for the fixing and subassembly of cylinder block: rollover stand, ruler, feeler gauge 0.02 to 1 mm, torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Fix the cylinder block onto the rollover stand. Clean all the sealing and mounting planes of cylinder block with non-woven fabrics. Check the cylinder block for any damage. Clean the oil and coolant passages. Dry them with compressed air. Check the cylinder block planers with the feeler gauge and ruler. The cylinder block top planers must be within 0.15 mm and within the 50 mm diameter should not exceed 0.025 mm. Install 2 annular dowel pins onto the front and face of cylinder block. Install the oil temperature sensor onto the intake side of cylinder block. Tighten the sensor to 20 nanometers. Tools used for the press fitting of cylinder liner: dismantling tools of cylinder liner, dial indicator base, internal dial indicator assembly. Before installation, check if the cylinder liner positioning surface and sealing surface are clean and intact without any burr, crack or dirt. Install the 2 O-rings respectively into the mounting groove. One above and one below. O-ring should not be twisted. Cylinder liner sealing ring and its mounting groove should be coated with clean oil. Lubricate the cylinder liner mounting hole surface with clean oil. Press fit the cylinder liner with special tools. Measure the cylinder liner protrusion with a dial indicator at 4 points separated by 90 degrees. Cylinder liner protrusion should be within 0.06 to 0.12 millimeters. Measure the cylinder liner out of roundness with the internal dial indicator at points C, D, E, F, and G. Each point should be measured in AA and BB directions. Cylinder liner out of roundness shall not exceed 0.03 millimeters. Installation of piston cooling nozzle and required tools. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Clean and check the piston cooling nozzle. Ensure that the nozzle is not clogged, deformed or oil stained. Install the nozzle. Ensure that its locating pin is sealed correctly and tighten its bolts. Torque to 28 nanometers plus or minus 4.5 nanometers. Note: check if there is any cooling nozzle uninstalled. Clean the base, back and surface of upper bearing shell of main shaft with non-woven fabrics. Ensure they are free of any scratch or burr. Assemble them according to the marks. Ensure the bearing shell is flush with its base at both sides. The locating boss of upper bearing shell should sit in the positioning groove of shell base. The oil hole of upper bearing shell should be aligned with the oil hole of the shell base. Shell surface should not be coated with clean oil. Note: shell back never be oiled. Tools for the installation of crankshaft assembly. Torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers. Torque wrench 200 to 1000 nanometers. Clean all oil passages of crankshaft and dry them with compressed air. Wipe the crankshaft mounting surface with non-woven fabrics. Check the crankshaft appearance for any impact, scratch, blister and rust. Crankshaft hoisting. Install the crankshaft onto the cylinder block. Lubricate each journal of crankshaft with clean oil. Clean the thrust bearing surface with non-woven fabrics. Lubricate the thrust bearing with clean oil. Install the first thrust bearing onto one side of the 6th main bearing. Push the crankshaft to the rear end of engine. Install the second thrust bearing onto the other side of the 6th main bearing. Note: the smooth surface of thrust bearing shall face the main bearing shell base, and the side with oil passage shall face the crankshaft. Clean the lower shell and cover of main bearing with non-woven fabrics. Carefully check if there is any impact, scratch or foreign material. If the used bearing shell is to be reinstalled, proper marks should be made during disassembly. Install the lower shell of main bearing. Ensure that the lower shell is seated correctly in the positioning groove with the main bearing shell flush with its base at both sides. Lubricate the shell with clean oil. Install the main bearing cover. Ensure that the annual dowel pin of the main bearing cover is positioned correctly. Note: main bearing cover is marked with number and arrow. Arrow should point to the front end of the engine for correct installation. Lubricate the main bearing cover bolt threads with clean oil. Install the bolts. Use a rubber hammer to gently tap the bearing cover until it is closely fitted into the bearing base. Then tighten the bolts by crossing from the center to both sides. Technical specifications. Firstly, tighten the bolt to 120 nanometers. Secondly, tighten them to 250 nanometers. Thirdly, rotate them by 120 degrees. Note: while tightening the main bearing bolt to the final torque, check frequently if the crankshaft rotates freely. Check the axial play of crankshaft. Axial clearance 0.175 to 0.425 millimeters. Tools for the installation of piston ring. Piston ring expander. Clean the piston with non-woven fabrics. Check if the piston ring groove is clean, without any burr. Apply a small amount of clean oil to the ring groove. Firstly, install the oil ring, with either side facing upwards. Secondly, install the twisted gas ring with top mark facing the piston top. Install the piston ring onto the piston with the expander. Finally, install the trapezoidal gas ring with top mark facing the piston top. Install the piston ring onto the piston with the expander. The openings of adjacent piston rings should be spaced by 120 degrees. The opening of each piston ring shall not be flush with the piston pin or other piston ring opening. Tools used for the sub-assembly of piston and connecting rod. Circlip pliers. Clean the piston pin hole and connecting rod pin hole with non-woven fabrics. Check them for any bump, scratch or burr. If the used piston pin, connecting rod and its bearing are to be reinstalled, proper marks should be made during this assembly so as to reinstall them to the original position. Piston pin, its hole and connecting rod pinhole should be coated with a layer of clean oil. Assemble the piston and connecting rod. Note that the connecting rod boss must be below the piston skirt notch. Piston pinhole on the connecting rod should be flush with the pinhole on piston. Install the piston pin and the positioning circlip. Be careful not to install any used piston pin snap ring. Check if the piston swings flexibly around the connecting rod during installation. Clean the upper and lower bearing shells and their bases of connecting rod with non-woven fabrics. Check if there is any bump, scratch or burr. If the used connecting rod bearing shell is to be reinstalled, proper marks should be made during this assembly so as to reinstall it to its original position. Install the connecting rod bearing shell. Ensure the bearing shell is seated correctly in the positioning groove with the bearing shell flush with its base at both sides. Tools used for the installation of piston and connecting rod assembly. Guide pin. Piston ring compressor. Feeler gauge 0.02 to 1.00 millimeters. Torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers. Use non-woven fabrics to clean the crankshaft journal inside of cylinder liner, piston, and inside of piston ring compressor. Use clean oil to lubricate the piston ring, piston skirt, crankshaft, journal, inside of cylinder liner, and inside of piston ring compressor. Install the two guide pins onto the connecting rod, during which be careful not to damage the connecting rod section. Rotate the crankshaft until the connecting rod journal to be installed reaches the bottom dead center, BDC. Piston top is marked with a number and arrow. Arrow should point to the front end of the engine for correct installation. Install the piston pin according to its mark, so that the openings of adjacent piston rings should be spaced by 120 degrees and should not be at the piston pin axis. Compress the piston ring with its compressor. If the used piston is to be reinstalled, proper marks should be made during this assembly so as to reinstall it to its original position. If a piston cannot move freely during installation, remove it and check if it is broken or damaged. After a connecting rod is installed in place, remove its guide pin. Use clean oil to lubricate the connecting rod bolts, threads, connecting rod bearing shell, crankshaft and journal. After that, install the connecting rod cover onto the original connecting rod according to the mark. Install and tighten the bolts manually. Technical specifications. Firstly, tighten the bolts to 85 nanometers plus or minus 4.5 nanometers. Secondly, rotate them by 60 degrees. Check if the connecting rod moves smoothly. If not, remove its cover for inspection. Use a feeler gauge to check if the connecting rod clearance is between 0.10 mm and 0.35 mm. Check if the arrow on top of piston faces the front end of engine. If the number mark is consistent with the corresponding cylinder. After the connecting rod cover is installed, check if the crankshaft rotates freely. Tools used for the installation of reinforcement plate at the bottom of cylinder block. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Clean the reinforcement plate with non-woven fabrics. Check it for crack or other defects. Tighten its bolts crosswise sequentially from center to outside to 46 nanometers. Tools for the installation of oil pump. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Special tools for front oil seal. Check if the oil pump gasket is clean without any scratch, bending or deformation. Check if the oil pump appearance is intact, free of any damage. Install the oil pump gasket. Pass the oil pump gasket through the two annular pins of cylinder block onto the front end of cylinder block. Lubricate the front gear of crankshaft with clean oil. Install the oil pump. Pass the oil pump through the two annular pins of cylinder block onto the front end of cylinder block. Install the bolts and tighten them sequentially to 23 plus or minus 3.6 nanometers. Install the oil pipeline. Check if the mounting hole of front oil seal is clean, and remove foreign material or oil stain if any. Use special tool for front oil seal to press fit front oil seal into its mounting hole. Note that the side of oil seal with English letters should face outwards. Tools used for the installation of crankshaft pulley. Torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers. Check if the single gear of crankshaft pulley lose a tooth, is cracked or has other defects. Check if the wheel hub is cracked. Check if the shock absorber is cracked, bulged, sunken or leaked or has other defects. Install the crankshaft pulley and shock absorber onto the crankshaft. Be sure to align the dowel pin correctly. Lubricate the bolts with clean oil. Tighten the bolts in a schematic sequence. Tightening torque. Firstly, tighten the bolts to 110 nanometers. Secondly, rotate them by 60 degrees. Tools used for the installation of idler gear. Torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers. Clean the gear, gear shaft and thrust plate with non-woven fabrics. Ensure that there is no bump, scratch or pitting corrosion. Lubricate the inside of idler gear with clean oil. Install the idler gear. Note: Install the camshaft idler gear firstly, and then the crankshaft and idler gear with the part number of idler gear, part number of gear shaft, and part number of thrust plate facing outwards. Tighten the bolts in the schematic sequence. Torque to 130 nanometers plus or minus 9 nanometers. Repto idler gear bolt, if any, should be tightened to 130 nanometers plus or minus 9 nanometers. Tools used for the subassembly of cylinder head: valve spring compressor, ruler, feeler gauge 0.02 to 1.00 millimeters, torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers, torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Clean the cylinder head. Check the cylinder head plainness with a feeler gauge and ruler. The longitudinal and lateral plainness should be less than 0.15 millimeters respectively. Check the cylinder head to ensure it is not cracked or worn. Lubricate the valve stem with clean oil. Install the valve, its oil seal, spring and spring base. Use the valve spring compressor to compress the valve spring. Install the valve collet. Note, it is a must to use a new valve collet. Check and install the rear lifting lug of engine onto the cylinder head. Tighten the bolt to 80 nanometers. Check and install the front lifting lug and auxiliary bracket onto the cylinder head. Tighten the bolts to 46 nanometers plus or minus 4.5 nanometers. Check if the camshaft surface is not scratched or oil stained. Check if the camshaft mounting hole is not scratched without any foreign material. Install the dowel pin onto the camshaft timing block. Install the camshaft timing block onto the camshaft. Tighten the bolts to 9.5 nanometers. Fully lubricate with clean oil the camshaft journal, flange, camshaft mounting hole and thrust plate. Install the camshaft into the cylinder head. Note, camshaft cannot be impacted. Tools used for the installation of rocker assembly: torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers, torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers. Clean the intake valve jumper clamp with non-woven fabrics. Install the jumper clamp according to its mark. Ensure it is installed to its original position. Clean the rocker with non-woven fabrics as well as its shaft and base. Then check the rocker assembly. Ensure that the rocker contact pad is not cracked or severely worn and that the contact pad could move smoothly on its rocker. Rocker shaft and its hole should not be cracked or severely worn. Use clean oil to lubricate the rocker shaft, rocker base and bolts. Install the rocker shaft back into its original rocker shaft hole according to the mark. Rotate the rocker around its shaft by 180 degrees. If the rocker cannot rotate freely, replace it and its shaft. Install the rocker back to its original rocker base according to the mark. On the cylinder 1, 3 and 5, the center pit of intake rocker shaft should face the front end of engine, and center pit of exhaust rocker shaft must face the front of the engine. On cylinders 2, 4 and 6, the center pit of intake rocker shaft should face rear end of engine. Tighten the exhaust rocker firstly and then the intake rocker. For the model with compression brake, tightening torque of exhaust rocker. Firstly, tighten the exhaust rocker to 40 nanometers plus or minus 4.5 nanometers. Secondly, rotate it by 60 plus or minus 4.5 degrees, tightening torque of intake rocker 65 nanometers plus or minus 5.4 nanometers for the model without compression brake. Tightening torque of intake and exhaust rockers should be 65 nanometers plus or minus 5.4 nanometers. Please tighten them in sequence. Check if the cylinder block top is clean. If not, clean it from inside to outside with non-woven fabrics. Check the cylinder head gasket and ensure it is intact and clean. It is a must to use a new cylinder head gasket. The locating pinhole on the cylinder head gasket should be flush with the annular dowel pin. Install the cylinder head gasket onto the top of engine block. Tools used for the installation of cylinder head and intake pipe. Special socket for cylinder head bolt. Torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers. Torque wrench 200 to 1000 nanometers. Timing pin assembly. Loctite 509. Check the cylinder head to ensure it is clean. Install the cylinder head. Lubricate 27 cylinder head bolts with clean oil. Install the bolts. Use special socket to tighten the cylinder head bolts. Tightening torque. For screws number 1 to number 26, firstly, tighten them to 90 nanometers. Secondly, tighten them to 150 nanometers. Thirdly, rotate them by 120 degrees. Note: the shortest bolt, number 27, should be installed into the threaded hole under the camshaft gear. Screw number 27 should be tightened to 46 nanometers plus or minus 5.4 nanometers. Confirm the compression top dead center TDC of the first cylinder. Firstly, rotate the crankshaft until the timing pinhole of the crankshaft pulley is aligned with the timing pinhole on the front gear chamber cover. Insert the timing locking pin to fix the crankshaft. After that, rotate the camshaft until the camshaft timing pinhole is aligned with the timing pinhole of cylinder head. Insert the timing locking pin to fix the camshaft. At this time, the first cylinder piston is at the compression top dead center TDC. Install the camshaft thrust plate. Tighten the bolt to 23 nanometers. Install the camshaft gear. Note: the 4 bolt mounting holes are unevenly distributed. Gear part number should face outwards during installation. Tighten the 4 bolts to 65 nanometers plus or minus 5.4 nanometers. Remove the timing locking pin. Check the axial clearance of camshaft. Ensure its axial clearance shall not exceed 0.50 millimeters. Otherwise, replace the camshaft. Install the front and rear covers of camshaft. Note: for the rear cover gasket, the side with blue glue line should face the cylinder head. Tighten the bolt to 23 nanometers, plus or minus 3.6 nanometers. Install the camshaft position sensor. Torque to 7.4 nanometers. Air inlet joint of air compressor should be connected to the intake manifold and then tightened to 45 nanometers. Install the intake temperature and pressure sensor into intake manifold and tighten its bolts to 3 nanometers. Clean and check the intake port of cylinder head and intake manifold to ensure they are clean without any damage. Install the intake manifold gasket. Install the new intake manifold gasket on the cylinder head. Note: the side with glue line should face outwards. The end marked with the part number should face upwards. Install the intake manifold. Tighten its bolts in sequence to 23 nanometers plus or minus 3.6 nanometers. Note: an air heater, if any, should be installed firstly, before the mounting of intake manifold. Tools used for the adjustment of valve clearance. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Timing pin assembly. Feeler gauge 0.02 to 1 millimeters. Special tools for the adjustment of exhaust valve clearance. Adjust the engine timing. Crank the engine until the timing pinhole of the crankshaft pulley is aligned with the timing pinhole on the front gear chamber cover. Insert the timing locking pin to fix the crankshaft. Meanwhile, check if the camshaft timing pinhole is flush with the timing pinhole of cylinder head. If so, insert the timing locking pin to fix the camshaft. This is the compression top dead center TDC of the first cylinder. However, if not, remove all locking pins to repeat the last step until all timing pinholes can be aligned with each other. Intake the valve clearance 0.36 plus or minus 0.08 millimeters. Exhaust valve clearance 0.69 plus or minus 0.08 millimeters. Note: only when engine coolant temperature stays at 60 degrees Celsius or below can the valve clearance be adjusted. For the model without compression brake, adjustment of valve clearance. At the compression top dead center TDC of the first cylinder, check or adjust the intake valve clearance of the first cylinder. Intake valve clearance of the second cylinder. Intake valve clearance of the fourth cylinder. Exhaust valve clearance of the first cylinder and exhaust valve clearance of both the third and fifth cylinder. Adjust the engine to the compression top dead center TDC of the sixth cylinder to check or adjust the intake valve clearance of the third cylinder. Intake valve clearances of both the fifth and sixth cylinders. Exhaust valve clearance of the second cylinder and exhaust valve clearances of both the fourth and sixth cylinders. For the adjustment of valve clearance with compression brake, at the compression top dead center TDC of the first cylinder, adjust the intake valve clearances of the first, second and fourth cylinders. At the compression top dead center TDC of the sixth cylinder, adjust the intake valve clearances of the third, fifth and sixth cylinders. Exhaust valve clearances should be adjusted cylinder by cylinder. Adjustment sequence: crank the crankshaft clockwise until the end of the letter and arrow on the camshaft gear is flush with the top of cylinder head. At this time, you can adjust the exhaust rocker valve clearance of the corresponding cylinder. The camshaft gear has 6 letter marks in total. A corresponds the first cylinder. B corresponds the fifth cylinder. C corresponds the third cylinder. D corresponds the sixth cylinder. E corresponds the second cylinder. F corresponds to the fourth cylinder. Adjusting method: exhaust rocker with compression brake. With brake piston, to adjust the exhaust rocker valve clearance, firstly press the piston into the rocker with a crowbar, then insert the proper feeler gauge into the space between valve head and rocker arm contact pad, then remove the crowbar. At last, tighten the adjusting screw manually and fix it. Note: the adjusting screw can only be tightened lightly by hand. Tighten the lock nut. Torque to 28 nanometers. For intake rocker, while the feeler gauge slides between jumper clamp and contact pad, feeling a certain resistance means clearance is correct. Fix the adjusting bolt and tighten the lock nuts. Torque to 28 nanometers. Tools used for the installation of fuel injector. Torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers. Clean the mounting hole of fuel injector. Ensure the O-ring is on the fuel injector. Lubricate the O-ring. Remove the nozzle cap of fuel injector. Note that the copper gasket of fuel injector cannot be omitted. The inlet cap of fuel injector cannot be removed. Install the fuel injector into the cylinder head with the fuel injector inlet facing the intake side. If the used fuel injector is to be reinstalled, proper mark should be made during this assembly so as to install it to its original position. Install the injector holder and keep it loose for the time being. The 6 fuel injector inlet caps cannot be removed. Install the rocker chamber cover without gasket. Note, it is prohibited to install any gasket at this step. Otherwise, the fuel injector and the injector sealing ring on the rocker chamber cover cannot be aligned with each other correctly, resulting in oil or fuel leakage. Tighten one mounting screw on each side. Connect the injector end of the high-pressure fuel pipe to the injector. With the injector end nut as a reference, put the fuel injector in the center of the sealing ring. Remove the high-pressure fuel pipe from the fuel injector and repeat this process for all the 6 fuel injectors. Remove the rocker chamber cover. Tighten the fuel injector holder bolt to 65 nanometers plus or minus 5.4 nanometers. Note, while tightening the bolts, keep the fuel injector moveless. Install the fuel injector harness and its bracket. Single injector harness connector does not have positive or negative poles distinguished. Tighten the nuts. Tools used for the installation of rocker chamber cover. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Remove the 6 fuel injector inlet caps. Check if the sealing strip of rocker chamber cover is clean and intact. Any cracked sealing strip should be replaced. Install the sealing strip onto the rocker chamber cover. Install the rocker chamber cover. To facilitate the installation, tilt the rocker chamber cover toward the engine intake side. Firstly, lower the intake side of rocker chamber cover onto the cylinder head. Then, lower the exhaust side. Ensure that the fuel injector harness connector is seated correctly with its positioning buckle at the connector top. Tighten its bolts in sequence to 9.5 nanometers plus or minus 1.8 nanometers. Install the fuel injector harness connector collet. Installation of high-pressure fuel inlet pipes of both fuel rail and fuel injector and the required tools. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Special socket wrench for high-pressure inlet pipe of fuel injector. Special socket wrench for high-pressure inlet pipe of fuel rail. Check if the sealing plane on high-pressure inlet pipe of fuel rail is damaged. If so, replace the damaged part. Replace the fuel rail if needed. Check if the fuel rail outlet and inlet are dirty or attached with debris. If so, clean them with contact detergent. Install the fuel rail assembly. Tighten the fuel rail screws manually. In order to keep out debris and dirt during repair, all openings of fuel system must be covered with clean and proper caps for protection. Check if the fuel rail, its pipe connectors and gasket are pitted, cracked or damaged. Remove the fuel rail outlet connector cap as well as the caps at both ends of fuel injector supply pipe. Install the fuel injector supply pipe. Step 1. Tighten the supply pipe connector at the fuel injector end by hand. Ensure the fuel pipe is in the middle of the nut. Step 2. Tighten the fuel supply pipe at the fuel rail end by hand. Ensure the fuel pipe is in the middle of the nut. Step 3. Tighten the fuel supply pipe nuts at the fuel injector end to 25 nanometers plus or minus 3.6 nanometers. Step 4. Tighten the fuel supply pipe nuts at the fuel rail end to 25 nanometers plus or minus 3.6 nanometers. Repeat above procedure for the rest 5 pipes. Note: connectors should be tightened to the specified torques with a torque wrench. Connectors, if under-tightened, may cause the fuel leakage. Connectors, if over-tightened, may damage the fuel pipe. Finally, tighten the 2 fuel rail bolts to 46 nanometers. The tools used for the installation of fuel pump. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Check if the drive gear, gasket, gear chamber, fuel pump mounting hole and mounting stud are cracked or damaged. Any damaged one should be replaced. Pre-install the fuel pump gasket onto the fuel pump with the gasket part number facing outwards. Rotate the fuel pump until the mounting flange is flush with the cylinder block bolt mounting hole. Screw in the bolt. Install the fuel pump onto the cylinder block. Tighten the 3 bolts of the fuel pump to 23 nanometers plus or minus 3.6 nanometers. Installation of both low-pressure fuel pipe and fuel rail supply pipe and required tools. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Special socket wrench for high-pressure inlet pipe or fuel rail. Install the fuel filter base onto the cylinder block. Tighten the 4 fixing bolts to 46 nanometers plus or minus 4.5 nanometers. Remove the fuel pump and the inlet and outlet connector caps of fuel filter. Clean the connectors with the contact detergent to be free of any oil stain. Connect the short low pressure fuel pipe to the gear pump outlet connector and to the filter inlet connector. Connect the long low pressure fuel pipe to the high pressure fuel pump inlet connector and to the filter outlet connector. Install the oil pressure sensor. Torque to 20 nanometers. Check if the high pressure fuel rail supply pipe is cracked or bent, and if its sealing surfaces at both ends are damaged. Connect the fuel pipe to the high pressure fuel pump outlet and to the fuel rail inlet. Ensure the fuel pipe is in the middle of the nut. Tighten the nuts at both ends of fuel rail supply pipe to 25 nanometers plus or minus 3.6 nanometers. Install the fuel rail supply pipe bracket. Tighten the screws to 46 nanometers. Note: ensure that no fuel pipe rubs against any other pipe. Tools used for the installation of fuel return pipe. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Install the fuel return connector onto the fuel pump. Tighten the fuel return pipe bolts of fuel pump to 24 nanometers plus or minus 4.5 nanometers. Check if the fuel return pipe and hollow pipe connectors are damaged. Use a new hollow sealing washer. Install the fuel return pipe. Tighten the fuel return pipe bolts of fuel injector to 34 nanometers plus or minus 4.5 nanometers. Tighten the fuel return pipe bolts of fuel rail to 34 nanometers plus or minus 4.5 nanometers. Tools used for the installation of air compressor and accessories. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers. Lubricate the rectangular ring and O-ring mounting groove of air compressor evenly with Vaseline. Clean the oil passage with compressed air. Install a set of brand new rectangular rings and a set of new O-rings into the air compressor mounting groove. Install the air compressor and tighten its nuts. Tightening torque. Firstly, tighten the nuts to 80 nanometers. Secondly, retighten them to 80 nanometers. Check the air compressor inlet pipe for crack or other defects. The air compressor inlet pipe, if cracked or damaged, must be replaced. Connect one end of air compressor inlet pipe to the intake manifold. Connect the other end to air inlet of air compressor. Clamp them tightly. Install the water inlet pipe of air compressor. Install the water outlet pipe elbow to the rear end of cylinder head. Install the water outlet pipe. Tighten the water outlet pipe elbow to 35 nanometers. Tighten the elbow lock nut to 55 nanometers. Tools used for the installation of engine rear end components. Torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers. Loctite 509, rear oil seal installer. Install the flywheel housing. Clean the flywheel housing mounting surface with non-woven fabrics. Check and ensure the flywheel housing is not cracked. As shown in the figure, apply Loctite 509 evenly onto the mounting surface with glue width at 2 to 3 millimeters. Glue line must be continuous without any breakpoint. Any breakpoint should be made up. Warning: if the assembly is not finished in 5 minutes after gluing, or if the tightening is not completed in 15 minutes after gluing, remove the sealant and repeat the gluing again. Install the two guide pins onto the rear end face of cylinder block. Use non-woven fabrics to clean the rear end face of cylinder block and the journal at the rear oil seal mounting surface of crankshaft. The glued flywheel housing is installed onto the rear end face of cylinder block along the guide pin. Note: during installation, the flywheel housing can't scour or shake on the cylinder end face so as to protect the coated surface. Tighten its bolts in sequence to 127 nanometers plus or minus 9 nanometers. Clean the rear oil seal mounting hole. Note: the side with letter marks should face outwards. Press fit the rear oil seal of crankshaft into its mounting hole until front end of tool is flush with the rear end face of crankshaft. Clean and check the flywheel. Ensure its gear ring teeth are not cracked or notched. Between the flywheel and crankshaft gear should be mounted with new friction gasket. Use clean oil to lubricate the bolt threads. Install the flywheel onto the crankshaft gear. Tighten the bolts in the star-shaped way. Tightening torque for without PTO, non-Repto type. Firstly, tighten the bolt to 50 nanometers plus or minus 4.5 nanometers. Secondly, rotate them by 120 degrees. Tightening torque for with PTO, Repto type. Firstly, tighten the bolts to 85 plus or minus 4.5 nanometers. Secondly, rotate them by 120 degrees. Tools used for the installation of oil sump. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Loctite 5999. Check the oil sump and its gasket. Ensure they are clean without any crack. The oil sump gasket corner should be evenly coated with Loctite 5999. The interface between front and rear gear chamber cover and engine block should be also coated with Loctite 5999. The glue line must be uniform and continuous with 1 mm to 2 mm of width. Note, the oil sump should be installed within 5 minutes after gluing and should be tightened within 15 minutes. Install the oil sump. Tighten it diagonally from the center to both sides. Tighten the bolts. Note, the oil sump must be marked during disassembly to avoid misreassembly. Tightening sequence is shown in the figure. Torque to 23 nanometers. Tools used for the installation of engine cooling module. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Remove the engine from the rollover stand. Mount it onto the engine base. Check the oil cooler. Check if the sealing surface O-ring is free of any crack. Check the water pump core. Ensure its impeller is free of any scratch or breakage. Seal ring is free of any cut. Clean the mounting surface. Install the water pump core onto the engine cooler. Tighten the bolts to 7.5 nanometers. Install the engine cooler module onto the cylinder block. Pre-tighten the bolts. Check the coolant manifold. Ensure that the coolant manifold O-ring, 3 sealing rings between coolant manifold and the cylinder block should be intact. Use T80 rubber lubricant to lubricate the O-ring between coolant manifold and engine cooling module. Install the coolant manifold onto the engine cooler. Install the 6 bolts. Fix the coolant manifold onto the cylinder block. Tighten the engine cooling module bolts in sequence to 46 nanometers plus or minus 4.5 nanometers. Tighten the coolant manifold bolts in sequence to 23 nanometers plus or minus 3.6 nanometers. Install the 2 bolts of oil connection pipe and then tighten them to 23 nanometers plus or minus 3.6 nanometers. Tools used for the installation of thermostat. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Check if the thermostat housing and bypass coolant pipe are not cracked, notched, or have other defects. Use P80 rubber lubricant to lubricate the thermostat and the engine cooling module at 2 bypass coolant pipe joints. Insert the other end of the bypass coolant pipe into the engine cooler mounting hole, the other end into the thermostat mounting hole. Install the thermostat base onto the cylinder head. Tighten the bolts in sequence to 23 nanometers plus or minus 3.6 nanometers. Tighten the bolts at both ends of the bypass pipe to 7.4 nanometers plus or minus 1.35 nanometers. Clean and check if any thermostat appearance is damaged, is cracked, or attached with debris. Any damaged thermostat must be replaced. Install the thermostat onto its base. Note, its dowel pin should be seated correctly. If the used thermostat is to be reinstalled, a new gasket must be replaced with. Install the coolant outlet joint. Tighten the bolts to 18 nanometers. Check and clean the coolant temperature sensor. Ensure that the sensor is installed with O-ring. Lubricate the O-ring and install it into the thermostat seat. Tighten the sensor to 20 nanometers. Tools used for the installation of exhaust manifold. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Loctite 76732. Check if the exhaust manifold, bolt and spacer are not cracked or damaged. If the used exhaust manifold is to be reinstalled, remove the soot between the exhaust manifold and the exhaust port on the cylinder head. Exhaust manifold bolt threads should be coated with a layer of high-temperature anti-binder. Install the exhaust manifold onto the cylinder head. It is a must to use a new exhaust manifold gasket. At the middle of exhaust manifold are 2 sets of short bolts and short spacers. The outsides 4 groups are long bolts and long spacers. Tighten the bolts to 50 nanometers. Tools for the installation of turbocharger. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers. Loctite 76732. Check if the turbocharger oil inlet and outlet pipes and gaskets are clean, intact or not damaged. Install the supercharger onto the exhaust manifold. Tighten the supercharger bolts diagonally to 81 nanometers. For engines with number less than 893-04940, for example 893-04939, their bolts should be tightened to 46 nanometers. Note: new sealing washer must be used on the turbocharger. New studs and lock nuts must be used. Studs should be coated with Loctite 76732. Install the lower end of oil return pipe into the oil sump mounting hole. Install the turbocharger oil return pipe and its new gasket onto the turbocharger oil return pipe flange. Tighten the bolts to 23 nanometers plus or minus 3.6 nanometers. Add approximately 60 milliliters of clean oil into the turbocharger oil inlet. At the same time, rotate the impeller to have the oil enter the turbocharger. Install the turbocharger oil inlet pipe. Lubricate the oil inlet pipe O-ring with clean oil. Install one end of the oil inlet pipe onto the turbocharger and the other end onto the oil filter base. Tighten the bolts to 18 nanometers. Check if the lower end of oil return pipe is pushed in place. Check if the gasket between exhaust manifold and turbocharger is not installed or installed excessively. Tools used for the installation of front and rear end accessories. Torque wrench 10 to 50 nanometers. Torque wrench 60 to 300 nanometers. Install the generator bracket onto the cylinder block. Tighten the bolts in sequence to 65 nanometers plus or minus 5.4 nanometers. Install the generator. Tighten its bolts to 46 nanometers plus or minus 4.5 nanometers. Install the fan pulley bracket. Tighten its bolts diagonally to 65 nanometers plus or minus 5.4 nanometers. Install the fan pulley. Tighten its bolts to 46 nanometers. Install the fan shroud bracket and tighten its bolts to 55 nanometers. Install the fan belt tensioner. Tighten its bolts to 55 nanometers. Install the generator belt tensioner and tighten its bolts to 46 nanometers. Install the starter. Tighten its bolts to 80 nanometers. Install the oil dipstick. Install the ECM bracket, torque to 23 nanometers. Install ECM and tighten it to 9.5 nanometers. Install the engine harness connector. Install the crankshaft speed sensor harness connector. Install the coolant temperature sensor harness connector. Install the camshaft position sensor harness connector. Install the fuel injector harness connector. Install the fuel rail pressure sensor harness connector. Install the intake manifold temperature and pressure sensor connector. Install the oil pressure sensor connector. Install the oil temperature sensor harness connector. Install the fuel pump actuator harness connector. Note: ensure that the harness does not interfere with any components. After assembly, check if any system of engine is not installed or is installed wrongly. Check if the fuel pipeline is not connected reliably. Check if harness connectors are not connected reliably. If the ECM is replaced, calibrate the new one.